Hey everyone, I'm rather Incoherent, and welcome back to another spoiler roundup for the Drowned City. Let's get into it with Michael McGlen, the new investigator for Rogues, and honestly, he's broken my heart a little bit, because I'll get into the problem with him and what upsets me so much when we get there. It's not the front of the character card, though. His stat line is impeccable at 3153, those are Mandy numbers with a 5 in your proactive stat. That's a rock solid stat line. 9-5 split soak is a little bit frustrating. You don't want to see a 6 in any number, you don't want to see a 5 in any number. You want your weaker soak stat to be a 6. A 5 is a little bit squishy, a little bit scary, requires a lot more concern and planning around, but ultimately not really a problem. Criminal Hunter tags, which actually matter now, but God knows I can't keep track of what's for what. All the specialist cards just gonna trip me up constantly every time I deck build for months. But the important part here is his ability. Reaction: after you spend 1 or more ammo from a firearm asset, gain 1 resource, limit once per firearm asset per round. So you're incentivized to use a bunch of different firearms to get more than 1 resource per round. And this is going to scale pretty tremendously with player count. If you were for some reason playing Michael McGlen in true solo, this is going to get you like 1 resource every 3 rounds at best. Conversely, if you were playing him in 4-player, it's very possible you could have 2 enemies show up in your location on the same turn, and you could spend every action firing a different gun and make 3 extra resources. I think that in 3-player, you can probably expect to get like a resource round out of this, more if you're playing a build that's good at using multiple different guns to kill enemies and you're not just encountering a bunch of rats that only have 1 health. I look at this and I try to think about optimizing it, but short of just getting lucky and having a bunch of enemies show up at my location, I kind of feel like I'm jumping through hoops to get where Jenny started. And that's not a good sentence, but mostly what makes Jenny bad is her stat line of 3s across the board. Having a 5 in your fist is a massively better stat line, I can't overstate that. The weak part of Jenny is not that her ability just gives you resources. Resources have value, and even though this does feel like Roundabout Jenny to me, it's not a bad ability, it's just kind of middling. His star is a +2, and you may place 1 ammo on a firearm asset you control. +2 with 3s in your mythos stats basically does mean that if you pull this on a mythos test, you will be passing it, which is pretty solid. And placing an ammo on a firearm asset is, again, kind of an underwhelming, middling sort of star. You look at this, you have the dream that you place ammo on a flamethrower that was about to run out, but the reality is that a lot of times you're on your final big gun for the scenario. You're not going to need any more bullets on your Gatling gun or your flamethrower, what have you. You're going to make it to the end of the scenario, and this does nothing. Or maybe your gun's about to run out. It goes from having 0 bullets at the end of a fight action to having 1 bullet at the end of a fight action. But either way, you're going to replace it with a new 45 automatic because you don't want to keep a slot with only 1 bullet in it as the team's main fighter. And of course, there are plenty of other situations where you're thrilled to have that extra bullet because it helps you solve a problem. It's just not consistently valuable, and that's what you want out of a star, really. So while it does do something, there's going to be a very wide range of how valuable 1 ammo is, and I'm not super jazzed about the star. But on the whole, he didn't really need great abilities, his stat line is kind of ridiculous, so let's get on to the deck building and signatures. And the deck building is solid. He's rogue 0-3, but unlike Finn, he has a crazy stat line, and his extra deck building is not just a restriction, he gets firearms, and that's not just traits, but also in the text box level 0-5, so that's going to include a ton of different upgrade cards and other various support pieces for firearm builds. So that's actually enough deck building to justify not getting the whole rogue pool, and kind of pretty interesting deck building. I haven't looked too hard at Michael McGlen, but I do feel a little bit of hype for his deck building tools. They're kind of one note. He's the most straightforward one-plan character in the game, probably. Up there with Carson, I guess. He is going to be the main fighter, he is going to use guns. That is what you're doing when you play Michael McGlen. There's not really any wiggle room with this. But that's not a thing that bothers me. What bothers me is his signatures. The Viola case isn't bad. I actually quite like the Viola case the more I've sat on it and thought about the card. It is a 2-cost accessory slot asset. It gives you 2 additional hand slots which can only be used to hold firearm assets. In reaction, after you play it, search the top 9 of your deck for a firearm asset and add it to your hand, shuffle your deck. And I really like this, both flavor-wise and in terms of how it encourages you to play Michael differently. Obviously, this card hurts in multiple ways in terms of competing with other cards. It is a 2-cost accessory that is Lucky Cigarette Case, and in many ways, Michael really wants that Lucky Cigarette Case. He's a 5 in his proactive stat, and it's going to be getting buffed by the weapons he's using, right? And that conflict is actually really cool. I like that it's there. I like that either you really want to prioritize Relic Hunter, which very few characters do, or you're actually giving up Cigarette Case, which again, very few characters do. So that's cool to me. I also like that this really strongly encourages you not to just play Underworld Market. Any non-rogue cards you're getting for firearms are probably not going to be illicit and wouldn't fit in your Underworld Market anyway, so it sort of encourages you to play a backpack Viola case tutor your deck strategy as opposed to just using Underworld Market to tutor one gun. It's really encouraging you to embrace the bunch of small guns, swap them around sort of playstyle, and giving you the hand slots you're going to need to really effectively play like that. I quite like Viola case, where it all comes crashing down and my hype for Michael McGlen gets severely reined in is his signature weakness, Confiscation. Revelation, shuffle each firearm asset in your play area into your deck. The rest of this text doesn't need to exist, it's just in case there's nothing on your board. Realistically, that first sentence is all it's ever going to do, and it's almost always going to do that. And for a character whose signature encourages him to play bandolier strats, and who wants to have, you know, like a Luger in one hand, a 45 in another, and a shotgun in the other two, losing 3 guns is a lot of play actions and resources to lose. But furthermore, the real serious problem here is that Michael McGlen, as I was saying a second ago, has to be the main fighter that uses guns. There's not like another Michael. That's what Michael McGlen does. So this is kind of a huge problem from a design perspective, because you're gonna draw this at some point, and when you do, on that turn you can no longer fight. And suddenly, when I think about playing Michael McGlen, I'm no longer thinking about all the cool big gun things I can do and how hard I can go into crazy bandolier strats and what support package is best. Now, when I think about Michael McGlen, what I'm really thinking about is how to counterplay Confiscation. And you can run like a Switchblade as one of your 4 hand slot weapons, right? And then even when you draw this, 1, you'll never discard 4 play assets of firearms, but 2, and more importantly, you'll keep the knife and you'll still be able to do something. You'll be a bad Tony Morgan for a turn, but for the rest of the game, you can be a better big gun Tony. So the Switchblade's sort of a solution to that. I think the best solution is probably Friends in Low Places, and you upgrade it to Search 9 and to rearrange the deck. And what you do is you use Friends in Low Places to control and try to draw your weakness earlier. And maybe you still need more than that, right? Maybe in addition, you also run... I completely blanked for a second there. Maybe in addition, you can also run Switchblade. Maybe just Friends in Low Places isn't enough. But suddenly when I'm thinking about playing Michael, the main thing on my brain is building a deck where Confiscation can't rip all my guns out of my hands on the turn the boss spawns, or on the turn the Kluver happened to draw Deepwind Bolt. There's just so much catastrophic potential with Confiscation that you kind of have to build your deck around this card. And it really reins in my hype, because on the one hand, it's cool that you're being encouraged to run backpack strats and not just use what is the de facto best weapon tutor in the game, an Underworld Market. But suddenly, when I'm talking about a big gun character, I'm talking about upgrading Friends in Low Places and Backpack 2, and not about getting big guns, right? And that's not very hype. Additionally, it made me sort of realize, as I was being down on all of this, that sure, you get all these really cool upgrade cards, but if your plan is to cycle through a bunch of tiny guns, then upgrading them before you toss them aside isn't really nearly as exciting. I do think Michael McGlen's set to be a really strong character. It's just that Confiscation in particular strikes me as a really unpleasant sort of design that I do not enjoy engaging with. I'm looking forward to playing Michael McGlen, seeing how much you can mitigate this, if he's actually fun for me or if he's just a guy with guns. But Confiscation really reined in my hype for a character that was otherwise set to like... I mean, I play bandolier strats voluntarily, right? I do the optimizing, the min-maxing, and then I say, I know it's wrong, but I'm playing bandolier anyway, all the time. So I was really hyped when I got to Viola case, and then I got here and saw the end result of my bandolier strats was not too far removed from what can happen to Tommy Muldoon. And I think there are better tools to deal with this than Tommy's weakness, but it still hurts the character's hype level so much. Moving on to random rogue cards, we have Where's the Party, a 0-cost event. Parlay, search the encounter deck and discard pile for a non-elite enemy and spawn it exhausted and engaged with you. Draw cards equal to that enemy's combined damage and horror values. And this is basically Kicking the Hornet's Nest 2 Electric Boogaloo, and I'm glad to see it. I think that design space needs to be explored more, and I don't think Kicking the Hornet's Nest was particularly powerful. Even the characters who wanted to play it, I found that I often regretted putting it in my decks, and very few characters really got a lot of mileage out of it. This is in many ways much better. You search the whole deck and the discard pile, so you never have the whiffs where you had with Kicking the Hornet's Nest, where you search 9 and find nothing, or even worse, you find the only enemy and therefore are forced to choose a 5-foot guy that you can't actually deal with. So removing the failure is good. In terms of the rest of the card, being a parlay is good for Alessandra, not particularly important for anyone else. The main thing is comparing gaining resources equal to health as opposed to drawing cards equal to combined damage and horror. I looked through a couple of scenarios and it basically confirmed my initial gut feeling, which is in almost every scenario you can expect to draw something that will draw 2 cards with this Where's the Party event. Drawing 2 cards is effectively the same as taking a draw action in terms of hand size, but it does dig you deeper in your deck. The main reason you play this is not for draw, it's because you need a guy to bully with pickpocketing and your character's ability. A Trish, a Finn, a Winifred, Lucius these days. There are plenty of characters where you actually have the cards in your deck and the incentive on your character card to just want to be able to reliably trip a dude. And I think this is much more easy to justify than kicking the Hornet's Nest in that niche. I do think it's a better card, and I don't think it's so pushed that you're gonna be playing it outside of that. I do need to give an honorable mention to Adaptable though, because while I probably won't remember to do this, I know there are people who will just Adaptable this in on certain scenarios. The Depths of Yath and Before the Black Throne come to mind, where there are just enemies with massive damage and horror values that are terrifying, and 1, spawning them exhausted is actually an upside. It gives you clear and easy time to deal with them, but 2, Where's the Party is kind of insane when you just Adaptable it into your deck for 1 scenario and then you use it to draw like 5 cards. It's a lot better when you do that. So on the whole, I like Where's the Party. I think it's a good card. I think it inhabits a good design space in the game. I cannot say the same about Doppelganger. This is gonna be a pair of cards here where I just kind of don't get it. Doppelganger is a 2-cost, 1 experience event. It's a spell and a trick, myriad and fast, so you get 3 for the price of 1. Play only during your turn, attach to your location, limit 1 per location. And the thing it actually does is after an enemy enters or leaves attached location, return Doppelganger to your hand. Either perform an evasion attempt against that enemy or immediately move to attached location. You may trigger this ability from any location. So essentially this allows you to evade hunter enemies by leaving this on your location and then walking away, and as they hunt after you, you get to trip them without actually being there. And I can sort of see the use case for that, but where it really just cripplingly falls apart, like for 1 experience and 3 slots in my deck, I'm not sure I'd be willing to put this in. Cards are really good. So allowing me to evade in weirder circumstances isn't something I'm not sure that was worth a card slot in the first place. But where it falls apart is this costs 2 bloody resources. That's a lot of money. I don't want to spend 2 resources every turn. Like theoretically, if I'm not using this to fight, if I'm using this, well, not fight, but move to the enemy, right? If I'm using this for the evasion attempt, which seems like the main thing you would use it for, what am I doing? I'm pickpocketing, right? And normally pickpocketing is good because it gives you a shitload of money to use on other things in addition to card draw with a higher level one. But I don't really get a lot out of pickpocketing when I'm spending 2 resources every time I need to pick the pocket. It just seems so expensive that I can't really imagine a deck where this is worth playing. I think most decks probably get worse when you add this to them. And that's kind of how I feel about Obscure. It's a 2-cost, 2 experience, arcane slot, ritual asset. Limit 1 per investigator, seal 0. You may resolve this keyword again after you reveal a location or put a new location into play. And I don't know if there's multiple zeros in every difficulty in every campaign, but I think that means that you are able to seal 2 zeros if for any reason there are 2 zeros in the back. Then reaction, when you engage an enemy, exhaust, obscure, release a token sealed here. Immediately fight or evade that enemy. During the skill test, your base skill value is equal to the shroud value of your location. Now, for the time being, I cannot for the life of me remember if this bolded terminology means you can only do a basic action or any action. And it doesn't even affect my evaluation of the card, to be honest, because realistically, this allows me to make the Chaos Bag meaningfully worse for my team. Like our odds of success do meaningfully go down when I remove a 0. It also drastically increases the odds of the auto fail as opposed to just making the bag generally worse. And in exchange for making the bag worse and having spent 2 resources and 2 experience and a play action and a card to get this into play, I get a free fight or evade action. Did I even finish reading it? During this skill test, your base skill value is equal to the shroud value of your location is really bad for the evade half of the action. Evade characters usually don't have a ton going on to boost their evade up that much. A lot of an evade character is base foot value. So when your base foot becomes your shroud value, using this to evade becomes a lot less reliable than using this to fight. If you're using it to fight, there's a much higher odds that like Lonnie Ritter and a gun is in your hand and you have at least a +2. With evade, a +2 is like the highest I'm ever expecting to see on a character, and most are lucky to have that. I'm not thrilled about the reliability of just using the shroud value of your location as your base value. This makes it seem really sketchy to me. And for this to be action positive, it needs to replace a card, it needs to replace 2 resources, it needs to replace a play action. So the play action's obviously 1 trigger, then a card's I'd say about a trigger, and 2 resources I'd say is about a trigger. So to break even, I have to get 4 free uses out of this thing, and that is a long time without a 0 in the bag, and I spent 2 experience to do this, and I'm just sort of left scratching my head. I can see how free fight actions are strong. I'm assuming I'm remembering it right and that this is a fight action where you can use like a switchblade or a big gun. But even so, like, there's plenty of other ways to get free actions in Rogue. I don't need this one. I don't have to spend 2 experience for this version of the effect. I'm just not impressed by it. I feel like maybe I just look at Seal Zero and I'm exaggerating how bad this is, but I feel like I'm meaningfully lowering the reliability of every action everyone takes for a frankly not that like I have to use it 4 times just to break even, right? It doesn't feel good enough at all. I don't really get Obscure. A card I do get is Bum's Rush. It's a 2-cost tactic trick event. It reads, evade, add your fist value to your skill value for this evasion attempt. If you succeed by 2 or more, deal that enemy 1 damage. And some ribbon text at the end. If that enemy is not elite, you may move it to a connecting location. That really doesn't matter at all. I know it will come up very rarely, just like it does on Cyclopean Hammer, but generally speaking, that is not going to be important. It's not going to do much of anything. Maybe it happens once in a campaign. The main thing this does is its jank sweeping kick for rogues. Instead of being 1 experience, 1 cost, it is a 2 cost, a 0 experience. Instead of being a fight attempt that adds your foot, it is an evade attempt that adds your fist. But where the cards really meaningfully differentiate themselves and where this one gets a lot worse is that instead of dealing 2 damage and tripping them, it deals 1 damage and trips them. And this gets into a very important part of any fighting skill or event that I put in my deck. Skills and events are backup weapons. They've only got 1 bullet, you only get to use them 1 time, but when you draw Sweeping Kick and miss your weapons, you can deal with an enemy. Bum's Rush doesn't do that. It does not guarantee you the ability to deal with a basic 2 health guy. It will deal 1 damage to him and trip him, and you will still have a problem you have to deal with. This does not function as a backup weapon. And that's a really important part of how I judge every single like ancillary fighting card that goes in my deck. All of the fighting events and all of the fighting skills. Vicious Blow would be far worse if I could only commit it to an action from an asset. That's part of why Strong Armed is not a transparent upgrade to Vicious Blow, is because you cannot use it on a basic attack. And Bum's Rush doesn't function as a backup weapon in that same way that Strong Armed doesn't function as a backup weapon. And unlike Strong Armed, which allows me to negate autofails on a Runic Axe, this just trips a guy. It's not a terrible card. I can definitely see Rita liking having this in her deck if she has the money to pay for it, Survivor economy and all that. But it's not particularly impressive, and I don't really see it making the slot in many competitive decks. I say competitive, optimized decks. Now that said, if you're a newer player and this is like one of your first sets, I can absolutely see this fitting into your deck, and you're not gonna be upset that it's in your deck. It's going to be relevant and useful. It's just not a particularly impressive card, and especially in light of comparison to things like Sweeping Kick, it looks a lot worse than I think it really is. Moving on to a couple of Guardian cards, we have Hard Boiled 0 experience skill, commits for a fist and question mark. I haven't really been covering commit cards, or commit icons rather. It's because generally you don't run them for their commit icons, so unless they're weirdly bad or weirdly good, I don't really mention them. They're not important. It has max 1 committed per skill test, but I feel like it's just there because skills normally read that and there otherwise wouldn't be that much text on the card. It doesn't feel like it'd be a problem to commit 2 of these to 1 skill test. Hard Boiled gains fist question mark for each successful attack you performed this round. And I'm gonna be honest, I don't get it. If you haven't done any successful attacks yet, this is an overpower that draws nothing. If you've done 1 attack, it commits for 4 fist, which is really good on a 2nd attack, but you've already passed an attack, so that sort of implies that you don't need 4 fist for the 2nd attack. Otherwise, if it was like really unreliable in the 1st attack, you'd be committed it there, right? So we get into the situation where we're talking about like, you're hitting an enemy and then using it for something else afterwards. And sure, in the dream scenario, you hit a guy twice, he dies, and you play Breach the Door and you commit this for 6 icons and it's incredible. But outside of like specifically you kill a big guy and then play Breach the Door, what are the question marks for if not more reliability while fighting? And this is a skill where the amount of reliability it gives you is inversely proportional to how much you actually need it. The more you succeed, therefore the more reliable you already are, the more numbers it gives you. But you've already succeeded a lot. I don't need 6 fist if I just hit a guy twice. I've evidently been able to do that without the Hard Boiled. So this sort of card, I just don't even understand the design space it's for, outside of being cool with Breach the Door. But I don't know that your Breach the Door deck wants to give up 2 card slots just for higher numbers on Breach the Door. And if it did, maybe there are better ways to go about it than this. Like, I don't get it. I don't get it. And it's not even like it's good for Mythos Resilience, because it's going to be the next round. It's just to be 1 question mark. I don't get it at all. Hardboiled confuses and upsets me. Quickshot I feel kind of similarly about, but I get where it like inhabits a good design space. It's a 2 cost, 3 experience event, myriad, so you get 3 for the price of 1, fast, play only during your turn, deal 1 damage to an enemy at your location, which is even at fast, a terrible rate for 2 resources in Guardian. However, reaction after you draw a quick shot during your turn, play it, reducing its resource cost by 2. So if you draw it, then you immediately play it, and it's just a free 1 damage. The issue here is there are very few Guardians drawing cards while there are enemies on top of them. In fact, it kind of seems like it might only be Marion, and even then, usually the way Marion's drawing cards is off of playing events, and I imagine a lot of those events, if there's an enemy on you that you're caring about, probably are designed to kill that enemy, so it has to actually be a moderately big guy to let you play quick shot afterwards, right? And if you, heaven forbid, draw a quick shot at any other time, it just costs 2 resources. So it feels like a very narrow range of when it's actually good, and even then it's just spend a card for 1 damage, which I'm not super thrilled about that rate of value for cards, but at least Marion has good draw, so it's not like it's a cost she can handle. She has the draw built in, similar to Mark. But the problem is just that, like, if you have to spend 2 resources on this, the commit icons are bad. It just feels pretty rough. The reason I kind of like this card existing, though, is because it's a card new players will intuitively go to use with Marion. It makes sense with Marion, it's at its best in Marion, and it's the sort of thing where as your collection grows, you will appreciate upgrading Quickshot into other cards like Sweeping Kick that actually just kill enemies and are generically good and happen to synergize with Marion, as opposed to Quickshot, which is like borderline unplayable in anyone else, I feel. This card feels incredibly narrow in its scope and not very good even in its niche. I almost just said Anchor Chain is bad and I refuse to read it, but I'll go ahead and read Anchor Chain. It's a part of a set of cards coming out in Drowned City for survivors. They're all 3 cost hand slot assets at level 0 survivor, and they're all discard synergy. They all have the first line of text where you can use them from your hand by discarding them. While Anchor Chain is in your hand, you may perform the below action ability. If you do, discard Anchor Chain instead of exhausting it. And the action is exhaust Anchor Chain, evade. You get +1 foot for this evasion attempt. If you successfully evade a non-elite enemy, you may discard 1 card from hand to prevent that enemy from readying during the next upkeep phase. And again, how expensive that is really depends on continued support for discard synergies. If there are cards that are insanely valuable to discard, this isn't even a cost, you want to do that. But I don't really see this card having any home. 3 cost in a hand slot is a big ask. Even characters that want to evade like Rita do not want to give up a hand slot and 3 resources to evade less often. I just don't really see what home Anchor Chain could possibly have, and it's because resources are so damn hard to come by as a baseline in Survivor, and then there are so few characters that like what they want to do is evade, but they also don't want to evade very much. They want to like evade as a permanent means of enemy management and then not evade very often. Usually when you're choosing to evade, it's either dealing damage like with Rita or generating resources and you want to do it over and over again like with pickpocketing. And Anchor Chain just finds itself in a very expensive, very awkward middle ground where if it's somehow good, it's gotta be because of discard synergies we haven't yet seen. But I still don't find Anchor Chain nearly as depressing as Handhook, the fighting card in this set of cards. In my Discord, a lot of people were really optimistic, hoping that Handhook might be a genuinely fantastic level 0 survivor weapon, and boy howdy is that not what happens. Again, it is a 3 cost level 0 survivor hand asset. It has the same starting line of text. While Handhook is in your hand, you may perform the below ability. If you do, discard Handhook instead of exhausting it. However, where it all falls apart is the actual fight action. Action exhaust Handhook. So already, it is a hand asset you fight with that you cannot use a second time in a turn. They have more than 2 health, shit out of luck, go somewhere else. You auto fail, shit out of luck, go somewhere else. This is a terrifying way for a weapon to function in the first place. Bold fight action, you get +1 fist for this attack, which is just normal bare minimum rate. If you succeed, you may discard 1 card from your hand to have this attack deal +1 damage. And again, if there are cards that are crazy high value to discard, suddenly this isn't a cost. This is really, really good. But right now, with what we've seen so far, this is kind of an untenable cost. If you want to deal with a bunch of enemies, this is going to cost you more cards than you can realistically discard. This is a problem. I can't really justify running this card, because even if I did run this card, I would still need other weapons to fight with. I would just run the other weapons. I would run meat cleavers, I would run fire axes. Why would I use a once per turn weapon that requires me to discard to deal 2 damage when other cards exist? Like, I'm not gonna sugarcoat it. This is almost every alternative fight option feels better than this. And it's possible that there are upgraded variants of these cards, and Handhook has a much better like level 2 to level 4 version. There could be like a level 2 version where discarding the card deals +2 damage. And suddenly, sure, it's once per turn and you have to discard a card, but if the guy has 3 health, it's not a problem, and that's pretty sweet. Maybe it could be a 4 experience card where it always deals the +1, or it doesn't exhaust, maybe both. And then you discard for a 3rd damage. Like, there are possible upgraded versions of Handhook that could be sick, wonderful cards that really elevate Survivor fighters. But dear God, is this not it? This is just horrifically underwhelming. I'm honestly thinking I'm more likely to see myself running Anchor Chain than Handhook, but honestly, if I run either of them, it will only be to test my preconceived notions that they're basically unplayable. Or because crazy discard synergy came out and I'm actually just playing them because I want to discard cards, and the text on the card where I'm actually fighting is not the important part. But I don't think we'll be playing Yu-Gi-Oh! After the Drowned City. I think this will still be just weak and underwhelming, and I'm very sad about it. A card I want to be hyped about is Gift of Nodens. It is a 2-cost, 5 experience arcane slot ritual. It doesn't commit, but again, it's a 5 experience card. You shouldn't be committing this for the 1 head. The icons on 5 experience cards very rarely matter. Reaction: when you commit cards to a skill test you're performing, choose a survivor skill in your discard pile and discard 1 card from hand. Commit the chosen skill to this test. After the skill test resolves, place that skill card on the bottom of your deck, limit once per round. So this discard cost actually hardly matters, right? Essentially, once per round, you can transform any card in your hand to any survivor skill in your discard pile. I'll also note that anyone with Mystic or Seeker access, including your teammates, can run Scroll of Secrets, which works as a lightning bolt across the map. And they can just take the cards on the bottom of your deck and put them back in your hand, allowing you to keep reusing the same skill card over and over and over again for a very long time, and there's potentially some very broken stuff going on there. The major issue with Gift of Nodens, barring cards we haven't seen yet, is that there aren't very many great survivor skills. Like, there's Sharp Vision, there's Brute Force, there's Resourceful to pull back events. Like, there are good survivor skills, but in terms of like building a deck around a 5 experience card to recur specific skills, there's actually not all that many, and Gift of Nodens, at least with the current card pool, doesn't strike me as something super impressive. I've actually had this experience multiple times where I sat down to upgrade like a 45-50 experience survivor deck, wondering what was left. And I was like, oh, I'll go check the skills. There's gotta be a skill I can upgrade or something, and just been horrifically underwhelmed by the skills I can actually put in my survivor decks. So while what Gift of Nodens is offering is powerful as a baseline, insane with good discard synergy, and borderline broken if your teammates are using Scroll of Secrets to throw the cards back on top of your deck, the actual skills, like the best thing you're doing currently seems like using Resourceful to repeatedly trigger out of Crossroads and just draw 3 cards for somebody over and over and over again. Because I've had games where I did that on Silas and it was sick and really powerful, and I was just drawing everyone tons of cards by repeatedly triggering out of Crossroads. But that's like the top end for a 5 experience card, not just a random synergy in a deck. That's not nearly as appealing. So there needs to be more powerful skills coming out in Drowned City for me to really want to run Gift of Nodens. And honestly, looking at it, I'm kind of afraid they'll just not print them for fear that it would make Gift of Nodens too powerful. That's kind of the impression I sometimes get when I see like really strong synergy pieces is, oh, there won't be support for this. They're gonna see how it does without the supports. I hope I'm wrong. I hope there's some cool skills to combo this with in the set. It would make sense from a new player perspective. So hopefully I'm wrong. Hopefully there's some really interesting synergy pieces for this and we just haven't seen them yet. Moving on to Seeker cards, we have a 3-cost, 2 experience slotless asset and Scientific Studies Grant. Limit 1 per investigator. You have 2 additional hand slots, which may only be used to hold science and or tool assets. Me personally, I love Bandolier strats. I know they're not optimal. I know they're not even particularly good. They're almost always setup heavy traps that make my decks worse. That doesn't stop me from playing them. It won't stop me from playing this. I'm just gonna tell you now, when you spend experience to put this in your deck, you're making your deck worse. This is a lot of resources, even for a Seeker. You're spending experience so that you can spend more time playing more assets and less time playing the game and progressing towards your goal. This is not a good card. It will make your deck worse. It's not going to stop me from playing it, and it's probably not going to stop half of you from playing it, but that doesn't make it good, it just makes it fun. Next up, we have Cosmic Revelation, a 0 cost 1 experience event. It is an insight and a spell, choose even or odd. Each investigator reveals each non-weakness card in their hand with a cost matching the chosen option, and then in player order, each investigator may choose to either draw 1 card from their deck or play 1 card they reveal from their hand, paying its cost. So this obviously interacts with player scaling a ton. This doesn't go in a true solo deck. In 2 players, it's not worth playing. In 3 players, it seems genuinely good. It's essentially 1 experience deep knowledge that you have to give 1 card to each player, but you don't put curses in the bag, and in addition, it also allows people to accelerate their game plan and take play actions instead. It's not forced to be the draw option, right? And in 4 player, it just seems like genuinely kind of nuts. I'm not super excited about the card, but I like seeing more support-oriented Seeker cards. I like seeing draw explored as something that can only be given to teammates and not just stacking all 4 cards on the Seeker because they're the main character and they're going to win the game and they don't need your help. I'm not sure how I feel about this from a design perspective, that it's so intrinsically tied to player scaling. I like that it exists. I don't know that there need to be a ton of cards like this, but I like it as a weird support Seeker card. I don't think it's bad. I think generally, as long as you're playing with 3 or more players, if you put this in your deck, it's not going to be a bad card. It's always going to carry its weight. It's always going to be a good card. I don't know that it really deserves a slot in a Seeker deck. That class is so many busted options. The top 30 cards that could be in your deck are insane, but this is not a bad card by any stretch of the imagination. And it's especially good in somebody like a Carson who has to play support anyway. And I've played plenty of things like support Daisy, support Rex, support Harvey, where this fits right in, and the fact it can't be used on me wouldn't matter at all in those decks. Can't all be used on me, I should say. Obviously, you get a little bit out of it, but you're really just replacing the cost of having run the card anyway. Moving on to the last Seeker card for the night, Working a Hunch got an upgrade. For 2 experience, you can now get your clue from any revealed location. So a second ago, I was saying that like there's really crazy stuff you can do with Seeker cards and experience, right? Working a Hunch at level 0 is probably a better card than Working a Hunch at level 2. Like, obviously, this card is objectively better, but it costs 2 experience. This is not as good of a 2 experience card as Working a Hunch is a level 0 card. And Working a Hunch usually doesn't even make it into my level 0 decks. For 4 experience, I could have cut one of my copies of Working a Hunch and added Cryptic Research to my deck. I don't know what we're talking about here. Because, like, at least if we're talking about Scientific Studies Grant, right? This is fun. There are people who enjoy playing setup-heavy decks. They like having so many assets in front of them they can't even count them quickly. They like having a huge pile of value in front of them that gives them something, turn over turn over turn. What's Working a Hunch for, right? This just feels like a way to kind of waste 2 experience. I don't know who's hyped about changing from my location to any real location. Maybe there's like 1 or 2 Hackerman enthusiasts out there that are really interested in this card, but dear God, I don't see it and I don't know why it exists. Moving on to Mystic cards, we have the Blood of Thoth. It is a 2 cost, 0 experience accessory slot, and that's always a little bit painful because it's competing with Holy Rosary, in a class that kind of only values head. Its ability is reaction: when 1 or more Doom is placed on a card you control, exhaust Blood of Thoth, place 1 resource on this card from the token pool as an offering. And then Lightning Bolt: if Blood of Thoth has 3 or more offerings on it, remove all offerings from it and exhaust it. Choose an investigator at your location to immediately take an action as if it were their turn. I think if this were like limit 6 offerings, it would be a much more interesting card, right? Like if instead of using all your offerings, you could only bank up to 2 uses of it, that would be something where it was like kind of interesting in terms of like saving tempo for important moments. But as it currently is, this basically just says every 3 Doom you place on your cards, gain an action. And sure, you can give it to somebody else, but theoretically, an action for you, an action for them. Either way, it's the same value. It's not a huge difference. And my main thought with this is that like most Doom characters, unfortunately, just happen to have bad head and really won't that Holy Rosary, except for Dexter, who could be spending the same slot, same resources on a lucky cigarette case. I just don't really see this as being particularly interesting or powerful. I want to say that I like this card. It gives action compression. I'm all about action compression. It's the strongest thing you can be doing. Is your character has to survive, they have to have reliable numbers, and then what differentiates a mediocre character from a great one is just how many actions they cheat out after getting to that point where they're surviving and passing their test. But the issue is Blood of Thoth is directly getting in the way of passing your test by competing with Holy Rosary, and that other characters like Dexter have other things in the same slot that form different forms of action compression. I just don't know that I think Blood of Thoth really does all that much. Maybe if it were like every 2 Doom instead of every 3, maybe you could bank it for more important tempo swings. But as it is, I'm glad to see Doom support getting printed, but I just don't find myself particularly impressed by this version of it. And speaking of not particularly impressed, let's get to Lost Arcana, which feels very impressive at first, and then I remember its Achilles heel. It is a 3 cost, 3 experience hand slot. It has use as 2 charges, and you may spend those charges as if they were charges on a spell or ritual asset you control. Reaction: after the last clue is discovered from your location, exhaust Lost Arcana, place 1 charge on this card. In many ways, this is bootleg True Magic, right? And the reason I say it's bootleg True Magic is because, provided you're not on 4 players, Rhino Seeking is often 1 action, clear all the clues on a location for 1 charge, which then puts the charge on Lost Arcana, and you've spent no charges, right? Lost Arcana basically says that you are not going to run out of charges. It's going to give you an insane amount of value, and that's really cool and enticing, same way True Magic is. Part of why True Magic isn't actually a bad card is because it saves you play actions. You don't have to play the spells. You don't have to spend the resources. That's not true with Lost Arcana. In fact, it's going to be more expensive than either of the other options because you have to play it as well. And it ends up inhabiting a space less similar to True Magic and more similar to Uncage the Soul 3, where the primary purpose of running this is to have more charges, not anything else. And with Uncage the Soul 3, I think I've only seen it be used to get more charges and replay an asset a single time. Generally speaking, Mystics just have enough charges to do their job and get through a scenario, unless they hit like 3+ autofills. It's not hard for Mystics to make their charges go far enough. It's just not a problem I experience at my table. So Lost Arcana giving me a nearly infinite number of charges sounds really appealing and powerful. Charges are great, they're worth 3 clues each. And then I remembered that like I already have enough charges, I just don't need this. Theoretically, there could be a version of the game where Lost Arcana was one of the most powerful, meaningful cards in the world. It's just not the game I'm actually playing in my experience at the table. Which brings us to the neutral cards, and Short Rest is another card where I was initially hyped and then a problem presented itself that sort of killed my hype. It's a 1-cost event, Myriad Spirit. Heal 1 damage or 1 horror from an investigator or ally asset at your location. Reaction: after an investigator at your location plays Short Rest, play another Short Rest from your hand, paying its cost. So obviously the way this wants to be played is not just 3 copies in 1 deck, but you're playing 3 or 4 players and you're all running Short Rest. And about halfway through the scenario, you all group up, and for 1 action, you drop, let's say 5 to 7 copies of Short Rest, and suddenly no one's afraid of dying anymore and you're good to finish the scenario. And that's a really appealing, powerful idea. However, it ignores 2 fairly massive problems. The first is that not everyone can afford to just slam down 3 resources of Short Rest and be happy with that. Pretty much any Guardians would be like, you want me to run 3 copies of a card that costs 1 resource? I don't really want to pay that. My beat cop's already soaking the horror. I don't really want this effect. I can do it, but I don't want to. So the economy cost is part of it. Another part of the card just being fundamentally inefficient is that 1 resource and 1 card for a damage and a horror, like ignoring the play action, the rate of a resource in a card to heal 1 is actually very, very low. To really feel like you're gonna have a good time with Short Rest, you need a team of characters with high draw, high economy, and a fear of damage and horror, right? Because you need to have everyone draw a big pile of them. You need to have them not be upset about the pile of Short Rest sitting in their hand for some period of time, which implies even higher draw. You need them to be vulnerable so that it matters that you're playing them, and you need to have enough economy on your team that you're able to all freely play them. And that's possible. You can make a team with Short Rest where Short Rest will be good. But it's a lot of hoops to jump through. I think in most teams, Short Rest will probably end up making your team worse because of the real downside of the card. It's not just that you need to set up the situation where everyone can draw it and can afford it and wants to play it in the first place. The real problem is that your whole team is running 12 cards that are basically doing nothing and rotting your hands for the first 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 turns of a game. And if those cards had, like, you know, done something, it would probably have helped you more than the Short Rest did, right? It's not bad. You can build a team where this is going to be a cool card, and I think it's worth doing at every table once, but I don't think it's good. I don't think it's anywhere close to good. As I say that, I'm having like flashbacks to me thinking Runic Axe wasn't going to be that great before Scarlet Keys. If I'm horrifically wrong about any card, I kind of think it'll be Short Rest, but I'm pretty confident this is just not it. Which brings us to specialist cards. I will not be covering the list of specialists for each card. I'm going to cover the card in a general sense, with the understanding that possibly looking at the specific people who can get it, it could change the analysis. But a full analysis of a specialist card like depends so much on the specific character, and I'm covering like 5 of them, so I really don't want to go through in painstaking detail for all of them. First up, we have the Mauser Tank Guerre M1918. 4 cost, 5 experience, 2 hand slot firearm. Hunter Veterans and Wardens uses 1 shell. That's a very specific phrasing. It's not supplies, it's not ammo, it's a shell. So all the traditional ways we have of cheating out resources, your adventures, your cleaning kits, do not work on this weapon. If you have it and it's ready, you can spend 1 shell to fight, you get +5 fists for this attack, and this attack deals +3 damage. And then you can action exhaust it to replenish the shell on it. And because it says replenish, you cannot load multiple shells, and because this says if it is ready, you cannot fire it after loading it. And that is a lot of hoops to jump through to make this very specific and niche in how it works. And it kind of just kills the card for me. The fact that I cannot end my turn by shooting it and then next turn load it and fire it makes it very finicky, far more finicky than Ornate Bow. There's no way to cheat it like there is in the decks that kind of make Ornate Bow look like a genuinely good card if you build fully around it. And where it really falls apart is when you actually stop and look at the math. You get +5 fists of this attack and it deals +3 damage. +5 fist is stupidly accurate, those are lightning gun numbers, but that's 4 damage and you have to spend another action reloading it, so 4 damage, 2 actions, 4 divided by 2, carry the 1. That's 2 damage for 1 action, those are machete numbers. This isn't a good weapon. You're spending 5 experience to play an incredibly janky standard rate weapon. It deals the same damage as Machete, as Meat Cleaver, as Shriveling level 0. What the fuck are we talking about here? This card feels like it had a lot of revisions and they took one too many nerfs to it and something somewhere broke. I'm gonna go out on a limb here and guess this used to say ammo. There were builds that cheated ammo onto it and it was crazy with Venturer. And now without like that use case, they're like, what's the point? This just doesn't do anything. Why am I gonna spend 5 experience for this instead of Time Worn Brand? What are we talking about? Continuing my theme of just hating specialist cards on average, what are we talking about with Dakota Garofalo? 4 cost, 3 experience ally asset, detective, hunters, and wayfarers get access to her. While there's a creature or monster enemy at your location, you get +1 head and +1 fist. Those are conditional fist bumps. I thought that was too conditional and not good when I misremembered it as when there is an enemy at your location, but it's actually even more specific than that. +1 head is predominantly useful when you are, taking a Mythos test. +1 fist is predominantly useful for fighting, admittedly, but it's also very good when, say, breaking down a locked door, doing any sort of scenario test. The fact that this only actually gives you those stat pumps when you're fighting a specific sort of enemy removes a huge amount of value that those stat pumps traditionally have. So what's her ability? A good ability or good soak can make up for it. Well, her soak is actually kind of below rate. 4 cost allies usually give more than 2/2, so her ability needs to be insane. You exhaust her, you choose an enemy at your location or a connecting location, move to the chosen enemy's location, and engage it. Now, if you are afraid of shooting over and your teammates are at another location, this is 2 actions. You move and engage for a lightning bolt, and that's pretty good. But generally speaking, there are just a lot of ways of finding movement hacks, and there are better allies, and this is very expensive, and the stat pumps are usually not going to be active, and I don't really know what we're talking about here. If this were more useful for Mystics, I would sort of see it as being like a movement hack for Mystics, and you use the +1 head on a fighting Mystic. But I'm just going to go out on a limb and guess that detectives, hunters, and wayfarers are usually not Mystics. So I don't know what this card is for. Like, the only use for Dakota is if you desperately need movement ability, and almost every class has better options than this. I don't see it, I don't understand, I don't know what she's for. Next up, we have Double Down. It's a 2 experience skill, commits for 1 question mark. It's available to criminals, entrepreneurs, and socialites. Max 1 committed per test, and after you commit Double Down to a skill test, spend up to 3 resources. For each resource spent, Double Down gains 2 question marks. So it is either 1 question mark, 3 question marks for 1 resource, 5 question marks for 2 resources, or 7 question marks for 3 resources. And if your character can't afford to spend those resources, let's just take that for granted for a second, because there are, like, looking at these tags, this is a rogue card in disguise. If your character has the economy to afford to do these things, spending 2 resources for 5 question marks, that's better promise of power, right? The curse icon, the 2 resources, obviously 2 resources is a bigger ask, but that's still in the same spot as promise of power. Generally, I don't like cards that offer only reliability, but that's because they usually offer less reliability than promise of power does, and this is competing with promise of power. It's a resource tax, and it costs 2 experience, so I'm not really sure it's worth it. I can see this being a late game upgrade in some decks. It's not terrible. I just don't know that at 2 experience, who I'm buying this early on. It's definitely not a bad card. I don't think I could ever imagine a deck with good economy being upset to have Double Down in its hand. It's very transparently good. It's just experience cards have to get bought in a priority order. Whatever's most important to you gets bought, and the stuff you think is cool usually stays in your binder. That's why I almost never play with Garrote Wire. It's a sick card. I love Garrote Wire, but I have other more important things to buy in almost every circumstance than Garrote Wire, and I think Double Down's gonna end up in a very similar spot where, sure, it's transparently good, but it's not something I need, it's not something important, and at 2 experience, it's just really hard to justify. I think if it were at 1 experience, I'd consider it a genuinely good card, and I'd frequently be looking at it. But at 2, that is a substantially bigger ask. It's not a thing where I'm just gonna fill out 1 experience left on an upgrade, and I don't know, I just don't quite see it. Which brings us to the Sacred Oaths. Sacred Oath is a 1 cost, 5 experience myriad card available to Cultist, Cursed, and Silver Twilight characters. It is a fast arcane slot asset, and it is limit 1 Sacred Oath, Oath of X per deck. There are 3 variants, Oath of Loyalty, Wisdom, and Order. You can only have 3 of these in play, so multiple people cannot run them simultaneously, and up to 3 can take up 1 arcane slot, so it's not going to be like, oh, you can't play all of them, you can only play 2 and it takes up all your arcane slots. It's perfectly fine, although it is still slightly inconvenient for a purple character to lose an arcane slot regardless. The reason you actually run this is reaction. When you draw a non-weakness, Pact, or Terror or Treachery, discard a copy of Sacred Oath from play, cancel that Treachery's Revelation effect, and discard it. And these keywords are going to vary from oath to oath. The Oath of Loyalty is for Pact and Terror, the Oath of Wisdom is for Omens and Powers, and the Oath of Order is for Curses and Hexes. So seeing Silver Twilight here, obviously Diana Stanley is looking at these with interest. Diana Stanley hears that you have a 1.66 experience, 1 cost fast cancel card, and like the rest of the text barely mattered. So Diana Stanley notwithstanding, what's everyone else think of the Sacred Oaths? Truthfully, I think they're a little bit awkward, because let's say you're in a scenario where you're not too concerned about curses, you don't care about omens or powers at all, and while you don't care about pacts, terrors do kind of matter. So you care about 2 of these cards. You really just want to discard the Oath of Wisdom to use a different one, right? It creates this awkward situation where if you draw Sacred Oath of Order first because you care about the Hexes, you don't want to discard it. You want to keep it in play until you can discard Oath of Wisdom. And that's a weird play pattern, right? Where if you draw Oath of Wisdom, it's useless in this scenario. You want to save it to discard for more threatening effects from the other 2 categories. And then if you draw these first, you want to save them to discard the ones you don't want. That's just a very strange play pattern, and it encourages you to have really high amounts of draw. I don't really mind that this demands high draw. I love building high consistency decks. I always run At a Crossroads, Deep Knowledge, Scroll of Secrets. These cards that really push the amount of draw you can have in a character are always in my decks. But this does need you to play the way that I always play, to reliably find them so you can discard the unimportant one off of this one without having one of them sitting dead on your board for ages. Where this card becomes kind of insane is if you're in a situation where you're able to draw all of them quickly, use 2 of them freely, and then start cycling your deck and using them a second time. But in a situation like that, that's kind of antithetical to how Mystics tend to play, and I have to imagine that out of these characters, some of them are Mystics who are not happy about the idea of permanently giving up an arcane slot. Between the weirdness of the play pattern and the amount of draw that this really wants you to have, I just don't know that I think Sacred Oath is going to end up being a good card. I think it's obviously good in Diana. That's just cut and dry, obviously true. But as for everyone else who can run this, like, I know it's a myriad card, but it still costs 5 experience, right? That's the major issue. It's not a minor detour for a little bit of Mythos resilience. You get 3 cancels added to your deck, but you also get 5 experience delayed. Having spent like a third of the year making deck lists and talking about the characters in the game, I can't imagine spending 5 experience in a deck core on anyone other than Diana Stanley on a card like this. This is not going to be something you plan to get early in a campaign on most characters, because there's other more important things to get. And once I'm like done with the deck core, we're at like 35 experience, we're going into session 6, I'm gonna get 7 more experience. What I'm gonna spend it on, I'm probably gonna look at Sacred Oath and think, oh, that's pretty cool, do I want to get that? And assuming I had draw, assuming that my arcane slots didn't matter, I know what I would say. I would say, well, I've made it this far without these awkward cancel cards. It's really hard to cut 3 cards from this deck, and I'm not even convinced I need these cancel effects, so no, I think I'll upgrade something else instead. That's the problem with Sacred Oath. It's just like, outside of Diana, who just needs it because it's a cancel effect that she has access to for relatively low experience, I don't know who wants this badly enough to spend the experience on it. Between recording the initial video and editing it, it turns out that some more cards come out, so we have 3 more to review. First up, we have our first basic weakness of the set, Down and Out. Revelation, put it into your threat area. Forced, when your turn ends. If you did not take either a draw or resource action this round, take 1 horror and shuffle this back into your deck. But action, spend 1 resource or choose and discard 1 card from your hand, discard this card. Honestly, this is one of the softest basic weaknesses in the game. This is, if you pull this, you're not gonna flinch at all. It's basically a mandatory action tax to just spend a resource and get rid of it. Because you get a resource and a card in the upkeep phase, even if your hand and resources were empty, you could still just spend an action to get rid of your upkeep resource to deal with this. This is an incredibly minor effect for a basic weakness. I'm never gonna be upset to get this, and it's relatively quickly gonna go in the pile of basic weaknesses where I pull it and I go, oh yeah, I've won campaigns where I didn't have a basic weakness before, and I pull another one because I don't want to have a non-existent basic weakness. But I will say there are a lot of weaknesses that also just break decks, so there do need to be some soft weaknesses. I'm just at a point in my lifestyle with Arkham where I don't want to play with weaknesses that do nothing anymore, so I'm glad this exists, but I don't want it in my decks. That's the final verdict. It's too soft of a basic weakness for my taste. Moving on to another Survivor card, we have some of the discard synergy getting revealed. Ample Supplies is a 1 cost, 2 experience, slotless asset, limit 1 per investigator, uses 2 supplies. Notably, it is a supply, which is important for backpack synergy for being able to search it out of your deck. And reaction, after you discard 1 or more cards from your hand, exhaust Ample Supplies, place 1 supply on this card. Lightning Bolt, discard Ample Supplies, move each supply on this card to your resource pool as resources. In the past, when they printed cards like this, where it generates tokens over time and then you cash in all of it for resources, they've usually started with 0 supplies or whatever it was for that card, and that made them incredibly slow and unwieldy and useless. Because Ample Supplies starts with these 2 supplies, it's notably less bad than similar cards. Now that said, it's not a good card. It still suffers from all the same flaws, right? After 3 turns, you have spent 2 experience to get an emergency cash. And theoretically, you can make a whole hell of a lot more than 3 resources. If you play this on turn 1 and you cash it in on turn 8, ignore the fact we're in Fantasyland right now, that's 9 resources, that's kind of wild. But this is also in Survivor and a discard deck, and I'm not really sure that there's gonna be anything crazy expensive in that deck. Ignoring the fact that you can always just draw this in the bottom half of your deck on turn 8 and it's a useless card, it's just a slow economy card that probably wouldn't have seen a ton of play at 0 experience, and at 2 experience, it is unfortunately not the first card in this video where I will say spending experience on this made your deck worse. This is not the discard synergy that archetype needs to see to get online. This is depressing. And lastly, we have Quick-Witted, a new Seeker skill. The image for it's so blurry, but there is a custom card generated for it to make it more readable. It is a 1 experience skill committing for Book, Foot, and it is Myriad, so you get 3 for that 1 experience. It's innate, which is a tag that does matter, but I don't see it affecting anything because I don't think highly of the card, which is just the trend for this video. Quick-Witted gets Foot ? For each other copy of Quick-Witted in your discard pile, and after this skill test ends, you may shuffle each other copy of Quick-Witted in your discard pile into your deck. So theoretically, you play these out, you shuffle them back in your deck, and the first one's just a book or a foot, but the second one's a book and a foot twice, and the third one commits for 3 feet or 3 book. And that's, I mean, the third one's all right, but like we're in Seeker, the average value of your 3 copies of Quick-Witted is a Unexpected Courage. Like most characters, I'm looking at Unexpected Courage and hoping I can find something better to put in my deck. This strikes me as an experience card that is worse than Unexpected Courage unless you can find a way to somehow capitalize on this final effect. I've seen people mention some fairly cool stuff involving like using Dream Enhancing Serum, and this will result in you always being able to put the cards back in your deck and keep triggering Dream Enhancing Serum turn over turn. But the draw from Dream Enhancing Serum is just replacing the fact that you're redrawing Quick-Witted really. So I kind of feel like I'm treading water there. Comparing it to something like Survey the Area, it's much worse if you just want a skill and seeker to pass a foot check. It's going to likely give you, actually definitely give you less foot than that does. I don't get it. Maybe someone more quick-witted than I can figure out what this card is for, but dude, I'm sorry to be a Debbie Downer. That's how I feel about this video. There are so many cards where I look at them and I feel like I either understand the card immediately and I think it's terrible, or I don't understand the card and I think it's bad, but I'm not confident and I'm mostly just confused. And I suppose like it's bound to happen. There have to be some card reveal videos where rather than being like interested in cards or hyped about cards, just by luck of the draw, all the cards in this in this like bucket of reveals leave me really underwhelmed. But yeah, consider me well and thoroughly underwhelmed by this batch. If you disagree with me harshly, I'd love to hear it. I would love for people to convince me that I'm wrong and change my opinion and make me more hyped about this set of cards. But right now, oh boy, between the delay on release and the batch of cards we just got, my hype for Drowned City has bottomed out. It has never been lower. I'm still looking forward to it, but this batch of spoilers was a bit rough. And before I wrap up, as a small channel update for anyone who's made it this far, I will be doing predominantly bizarre content in the near future. Once Drowned City comes out, it's likely I'll return to Arkham in a more dedicated fashion, but in the near future, I'm gonna be focusing very heavily on bizarre content for the next month. I'm done with my hiatus for the time being. I'm gonna be coming back to content production, but it will be for the new patch of Bizarre. Hopefully for the foreseeable future. We'll see how I feel about the game. Its meta is constantly changing, it's evolving very quickly, and some metas I've loved the game to bits, and some metas I've been like, I'm gonna wait a week. But for now, I've been talking about Arkham, I've said everything I had to say about the upcoming cards. Let's call it here. I've been rather Incoherent, thank you for your time. If you made it this far, then please do hit all the buttons, do the algorithm stuff, you know the drill. And before I leave, a massive shout out to everyone supporting this channel, both as patrons over on Patreon and here on YouTube as channel members. Thank you for your time, and I'll see you in the next one.